Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dig into how a tiny, microscopic killer literally brought an entire continent to its knees and, kind of by accident, ended up building the world we know today. So, to really get a grip on just how big this was, you have to start with this number 50%. In just a handful of years, in the middle of the 14th century, that's how much of Europe's population just vanished. Gone. I mean, half of everyone. It's a scale of catastrophe that's almost impossible to wrap your head around. But behind a staggering number like that are just countless heartbreaking personal stories. This quote from a chronicler in Siena, Italy, man, it just hits you right in the gut. He says, "I buried my 5 children with my own hands." This wasn't just about people dying. It was about the complete and utter collapse of society itself. Fear just tore everything apart. All right, so let's get into it. How on earth did a world collapse like this? Well, the catastrophe that was going to reshape a whole continent, it didn't start with some big explosion. It started as a scary rumor, a whisper coming from the east. And the story of how it actually got to Europe is, well, it's pretty wild. It's 1347. We're at the Crimean port of Kaffa. The city is under siege by a Mongol army, but the army itself is being torn apart by this mysterious disease. So what do? In one of the first acts of biological warfare, they supposedly started catapulting their own infected dead bodies over the city walls. A group of Italian merchants from Genoa managed to escape by sea, but they had no idea they were taking the killer with them. Their ships basically became these floating death traps, sailing across the Mediterranean, about to unleash hell. And when it hit, nobody had seen anything like it. They called it the Great Pestilence. The symptoms? They were just horrifying. First, you'd get these big swollen lumps in your groin or armpits. They called them buboes, which is where we get the name bubonic plague. Then came the high fever, you'd start vomiting blood, and these dark, black spots would appear on your skin. Once you had a diagnosis, well, that was pretty much a death sentence. Most people were gone within a week. And this is where society just completely fell apart. That same chronicler, Agnolo di Tura, he wrote that the fear of catching it was so intense. The most basic human connections just snapped. Father abandoned child, husband abandoned wife. People were dying all alone, sometimes just left in their houses for days. It's truly terrifying to imagine. Okay, so you have to put yourself in their shoes, right? There's no concept of germs or viruses. The world is ending around you. People were absolutely desperate for an answer. Anything. What could possibly be causing this much death so randomly, so quickly? Well, the answers they came up with were pretty different. On one hand, you had the academics, the big shot physicians at places like the University of Paris. They blamed miasma, basically bad air. They thought a weird alignment of planets had corrupted the atmosphere. But for your average person on the street, the only explanation that seemed to fit the horror was that God himself was angry, that this was divine punishment for the sins of mankind. And here's what happens when people are terrified and don't have real answers. They look for someone to blame. And that search for a scapegoat, it unleashed a whole new kind of horror on top of the plague itself. A wave of absolutely brutal persecution that swept across Europe. So who did they blame? Well, it was anyone who was already seen as an outsider. Jewish communities were targeted viciously. They were accused of poisoning the town wells to spread the plague, and entire communities were massacred. But it didn't stop there. Foreigners, religious pilgrims, even people with skin conditions like leprosy or bad acne, they were all targets. By 1351, over 200 Jewish communities had been wiped out. It was terror turning into absolute brutality. So all that fear and superstition meant the real killer stayed a mystery for centuries. It wasn't until modern science came along that we could finally play detective and solve this, 600-year-old cold case. So what was it? What was the actual microscopic culprit that could cause this much devastation? The answer is a little bacterium called Yersinia pestis. Now, here's the thing. It's not actually a human killer by design. It's a specialist that lives in fleas that live on rodents, like rats. We humans, we were just an accidental target, a tragic and, for the bacteria, a very effective one. And the way this thing spreads is, well, it's horrifyingly brilliant. So a flea bites an infected rat. The bacteria then multiplies like crazy inside the flea's gut until it creates a blockage. This basically starves the flea, making it ravenous. So it bites the next thing it sees, maybe a person, and because its gut is blocked, when it tries to feed, it just ends up vomiting thousands of these bacteria right into the bite wound. It turns the flea into a perfect little plague-injecting machine. So how did we finally prove this? Well, the ultimate proof didn't come from dusty old books. It came from a new kind of witness, the skeletons of the victims themselves. Their bones held the final clue. This is where modern science gets really cool. Back in 2010, scientists were able to drill into the teeth of skeletons from mass graves, these plague pits, all across Europe. And inside the dental pulp, they found it, the unmistakable DNA signature of Yersinia pestis. That was the smoking gun. It ended the debate for good. They were even able to trace that specific strain back to its likely origin in the mountains of Central Asia. And the DNA also confirmed something else, that there was another form, a pneumonic plague, that could spread through the air just by coughing, which explains why it moved so unbelievably fast. So the plague was this absolute, horrifying end for millions and millions of people, but it was also a beginning. Because the world that crawled out of the wreckage of the Black Death was a completely different place. Think about it, with half the workforce just gone. Suddenly, there was a massive labor shortage. The people who survived, the peasants, the farmers, the craftspeople, their work was suddenly worth a whole lot more. For the first time, maybe ever, they had real power to negotiate. And that shift in power? It basically killed the old feudal system. Before, if you were a serf, you were tied to your lord's land for life. But now, you could just pack up and leave for a better-paying job somewhere else. Landowners had to actually compete for workers. This wasn't just about money, it was a total social revolution. It tore down the old medieval order and planted the seeds for the modern world. And believe it or not, something we're all very familiar with came directly out of this crisis, the idea of quarantine. The port city of Ragusa, that's modern-day Dubrovnik, started forcing ships to anchor and wait for 40 days before anyone could come ashore to make sure they weren't sick. The Italian word for 40 is quaranta, and that's literally where we get the word quarantine. But here's the thing. The Black Death wasn't a one-and-done event. Its shadow is long. This was just the beginning of a very long, very deadly relationship between humanity and this particular bacterium. The plague kept coming back, again and again, in massive waves for hundreds of years. You had the Great Plague of London in the 1600s, another huge outbreak in Marseille in the 1700s. A third pandemic even started in China in the 1800s and went global. And here's the kicker. Even today, it's not gone. We have antibiotics now, sure, but cases of the plague still pop up every single year, all around the world. So the story of the Black Death isn't just history. It's a really stark reminder of how one tiny pathogen can bring our entire world to a grinding halt. And it forces us to ask a pretty uncomfortable question, doesn't it? In our modern world, with planes connecting every corner of the globe and with the very real threat of antibiotic-resistant bugs, if a killer like this ever came back, are we really ready?